Welcome to this journey of one of the most disturbing cases in recorded history, New Orleans, Louisiana. Before we begin, I invite you to leave a comment about where you're watching from and the exact time you heard this story. We're interested in knowing where and at what times of day or night these documented accounts arrive. In the suffocating heat of August 1913, the LaLaurie mansion at 1140 Royal Street stood like a wound that refused to heal in the heart of New Orleans' French Quarter. The three-story Creole townhouse had remained largely abandoned since the notorious events of 1834, when Madame Delphine LaLaurie fled the city under cover of night, leaving behind a legacy that would stain the cobblestones of Royal Street for generations. The building's shuttered windows and rusted ironwork had become as familiar to neighborhood residents as the morning fog that rolled in from the Mississippi River, carrying with it the scents of coffee, molasses, and something indefinably darker that seemed to cling to the narrow streets like a persistent memory. Mrs. Evangeline Tremaine lived directly across Royal Street in a modest two-story Creole cottage that had belonged to her family since before the war between the states. The house, with its characteristic French doors opening onto a narrow balcony, provided an unobstructed view of the LaLaurie property. At 63, Mrs. Tremaine possessed the sharp eyes and methodical nature of someone who had witnessed the quarter's transformation through decades of social and economic change. Her late husband had been a cotton factor who conducted business with merchants from across the Caribbean, and their home had once hosted elaborate dinner parties for the city's commercial elite. Since becoming a widow in 1909, Mrs. Tremaine had settled into a quieter routine that revolved around careful observation of her neighborhood. Her daily habits included morning coffee on her front gallery, where she could watch the comings and goings of Royal Street residents while remaining largely unnoticed herself. She maintained detailed journals of neighborhood activities, a practice that began as simple record-keeping but had evolved into something approaching documentary thoroughness. These journals, discovered among her estate papers in 1965, would prove to be the most comprehensive account of the events that began to unfold in September 1913. The LaLaurie mansion itself stood as a testament to the architectural grandeur of antebellum New Orleans. Built in the 1830s, it represented the height of Creole design with its characteristic mixture of French colonial and Spanish influences. The building's facade featured elaborate cast-iron balconies on the second and third floors, their intricate patterns now darkened with age and neglect. Tall French windows, fitted with wooden shutters that had remained closed for nearly 8 decades, suggested the gracious, entertaining spaces that lay within. The mansion's courtyard, barely visible from the street through a heavy iron gate, contained what had once been formal gardens, but had long since surrendered to subtropical vegetation that grew wild and unchecked. The property occupied a corner lot that commanded Royal Street from Governor Nichols Street to Ursulines, making it impossible for neighborhood residents to ignore its brooding presence. Local stories about the mansion had evolved over the decades into a mixture of historical fact and embellished folklore. Longtime residents spoke in hushed tones about the original owner's activities, though specific details had become blurred with time and repetitive telling. What remained consistent in all accounts was the understanding that terrible things had occurred within those walls, creating an atmosphere of unease that persisted long after the perpetrators had disappeared. On September 12, 1913, Mrs. Tremaine was awakened by the sound of iron wheels on cobblestones during the pre-dawn hours. From her bedroom window, she observed a closed carriage stopping in front of the LaLaurie mansion's main gate. The carriage itself was unremarkable, a typical four-wheeled vehicle of the sort used for transporting passengers and luggage throughout the quarter. However, its presence at such an early hour, and specifically at the abandoned LaLaurie property, was sufficiently unusual to merit her attention and immediate documentation in her bedside journal. By the time Mrs. Tremaine had positioned herself at her window, the carriage had already departed, leaving behind only the sound of hooves retreating toward Chartres Street. However, she could clearly see that someone had entered the mansion grounds, as a single lamp now burned in what she knew to be the eastern wing's ground floor window. This light represented the first sign of occupancy the building had shown since her arrival in the neighborhood more than 4 decades earlier. The lamp's steady glow continued throughout the remainder of the night, casting long shadows through the mansion's overgrown courtyard. Henri LaLaurie had indeed returned to New Orleans after nearly 3 decades of residence in various European cities. Parish records show he had contacted the Orleans Parish Planning Office several weeks before his arrival, requesting access to the original architectural surveys and building permits associated with the family property. City Clerk Thomas Boudreau, who had worked in the planning office since 1889, later recalled that Henri seemed particularly interested in documentation related to sections of the building that had been sealed following his ancestors' hasty departure in 1834. The planning office records from this period, preserved in the Louisiana State Archives, show that Henri spent considerable time reviewing building permits, architectural modifications, and property assessments dating back to the mansion's original construction. Of particular interest were documents related to structural modifications that had been made during the 1830s, including the addition of basement storage areas and what appeared to be extensive modifications to the building's interior layout. These changes had never been fully documented in the official city records, suggesting that much of the work had been conducted without proper permits or oversight. When questioned about his intentions for the property, Henri provided only vague responses about restoring certain aspects of the family legacy and correcting historical inaccuracies that had accumulated over time. City officials found his answers satisfactory, as property owners were generally considered to have broad discretion regarding the modification and restoration of their holdings, particularly when dealing with structures of historical significance. The first indication that Henri's return would prove noteworthy came within a week of his documented arrival in the city. Local merchants along Royal Street, Magazine Street, and the French Market began reporting visits from a well-dressed gentleman who spoke with a slight French accent and conducted all transactions using gold coins rather than the paper currency or bank drafts more commonly employed for significant purchases. These transactions wouldn't have attracted particular attention in a city accustomed to international commerce, except for the unusual nature and quantities of the items he requested. James Melanson, who operated a well-established hardware establishment on Magazine Street, maintained detailed ledgers of all customer transactions, as was customary for businesses serving the quarter's construction and maintenance needs. His records, which survived until their destruction in a warehouse fire in 1952, documented Henri's systematic acquisition of materials that seemed inconsistent with standard residential renovation projects. Instead of the lumber, nails, standard fixtures, and decorative elements typically associated with restoration work, Henri purchased specialized items that suggested more unusual applications. The materials Henri requested included heavy-duty locks of institutional quality, specialized ventilation components designed for underground applications, and large quantities of sound-dampening materials more commonly used in commercial or industrial buildings. Melanson noted that Henri seemed particularly interested in hardware that could ensure complete isolation of interior spaces, including multiple-layer door systems and window modifications that would prevent both sound transmission and visual observation from outside the building. Other merchants throughout the quarter reported similar unusual purchases. At the French Market, Henri acquired non-perishable foodstuffs in quantities that seemed excessive for a single resident. These purchases included preserved meats, dried fruits, hardtack biscuits, and other items that could sustain multiple people for extended periods without requiring fresh provisions. The food purchases followed a pattern that suggested systematic planning for long-term storage rather than typical household provisioning. Pharmacists and medical supply vendors along Magazine Street reported visits from Henri during which he requested materials and information that seemed more appropriate for institutional medical facilities than private residences. Dr. Augustin Moreau, whose medical practice had served the French Quarter community since 1895, documented several consultations with Henri, during which the gentleman requested detailed information about maintaining physical wellness during extended periods of limited mobility and environmental restriction. Mrs. Tremaine's observations during Henri's first weeks at the mansion revealed patterns that defied straightforward explanation. The lamp that had appeared in the eastern wing window on the night of his arrival continued to burn from sunset to sunrise every night, but it never moved from room to room, as would be expected if someone were simply using the space for normal residential purposes. Instead, the light remained stationary in the same window, casting identical shadows against the shuttered windows night after night, as if marking a specific location rather than providing illumination for daily activities. The regularity of this pattern suggested that Henri maintained extremely disciplined habits or that the lamp served some purpose other than conventional lighting. Mrs. Tremaine noted that the light appeared at precisely sunset each evening and was extinguished exactly at dawn, suggesting either mechanical timing or human attention to astronomical precision that seemed unusual for typical residential occupation. During daylight hours, Henri was occasionally observed moving about the mansion's grounds, though his activities seemed purposeful rather than casual. Unlike someone simply living in the space, Henri appeared to be conducting systematic inspections of the building's exterior, paying particular attention to areas where the structure met the ground, and examining what appeared to be ventilation openings that weren't visible from the street. These inspections suggested familiarity with architectural details that wouldn't be apparent to someone encountering the building for the first time. Neighborhood residents noted that Henri's daytime appearances followed a regular schedule, with most sightings occurring during the early morning hours when foot traffic on Royal Street remained minimal. He dressed consistently in dark, well-tailored clothing appropriate for a gentleman of means, but his attire seemed more suitable for indoor work than the construction activities suggested by his material purchases. This discrepancy between his appearance and his documented acquisitions created questions about the nature of the work he was conducting within the mansion. By early October, other lights began appearing in various windows throughout the mansion's eastern wing. Mrs. Tremaine documented the gradual illumination of what appeared to be 4 separate rooms on the ground floor and 3 on the second story, with occasional lights visible on the 3rd floor as well. However, she noted that these lights never appeared simultaneously. Instead, they followed a precise sequence, with one light extinguishing as another appeared, creating a pattern of illumination that moved through the building according to what seemed to be a predetermined schedule. The sequence of lighting suggested systematic movement through the building's interior, but the timing seemed too regular for normal human activity. The lights would appear in the eastern ground floor window for exactly 45 minutes, then shift to a second-floor window for the same duration, followed by movement to other locations throughout the wing. This pattern repeated nightly with mechanical precision that seemed inconsistent with the irregular schedules typically associated with residential occupation. Mrs. Tremaine attempted to map the lighting sequence against her understanding of the mansion's interior layout, based on her knowledge of similar Creole architecture throughout the quarter. However, the pattern of illumination suggested room connections and interior pathways that didn't correspond to the building's known floor plan. This discrepancy implied either that Henri had created new passages within the structure, or that the building's original interior had been more complex than architectural records indicated. The sounds began during the second week of October, marking a new phase in the mysterious activities within the LaLaurie mansion. Residents along Royal Street reported hearing noises emanating from the building that didn't correspond to typical renovation work or normal residential activity. Instead of the hammering, sawing, and general construction sounds that would be expected from someone restoring an abandoned building, neighbors described what could only be characterized as methodical movements that occurred exclusively during nighttime hours. These sounds followed the same precise timing as the moving lights, traveling from room to room according to the same invisible schedule that had characterized the lighting pattern. However, the acoustic properties of these activities puzzled residents familiar with the quarter's typical nighttime environment. The sound seemed to travel through the building structure in ways that defied normal understanding of how sound moved through enclosed spaces, suggesting either unusual construction techniques or activities that generated sound in unexpected ways. Mrs. Tremaine's journal entries from this period describe sounds that seemed to emerge from beneath the building itself rather than from the documented interior spaces. "There are movements below," she wrote on October 15th, "not the settling of an old structure or the scurrying of small creatures, but deliberate activity in spaces that shouldn't exist according to the building's known foundation. The sounds travel through the ground itself and seem to connect with similar activities occurring within the mansion's documented rooms." Other residents reported similar observations about subterranean activities that seemed to extend beyond the building's official footprint. These reports suggested that Henri's modifications to the property included excavation or expansion of basement areas that weren't reflected in any city records or architectural surveys. The sounds described by neighbors indicated systematic work being conducted in underground spaces, possibly connecting the mansion to adjacent properties or extending beneath Royal Street itself. The timing of these subterranean activities coincided with the surface movements documented by Mrs. Tremaine, suggesting coordination between different aspects of Henri's project. The underground sounds would begin shortly before the first lights appeared in the mansion's windows, continue throughout the nightly sequence of illuminated rooms, and conclude when the final lights were extinguished at dawn. This coordination implied systematic planning and implementation of activities that required both surface and subsurface components. Dr. Augustine Moreau, whose medical practice occupied a building on Chartres Street within 6 blocks of the LaLaurie mansion, began receiving patients with complaints that challenged conventional medical understanding. Starting in mid-October, several residents within a clearly defined geographic area around Royal Street sought treatment for persistent sleep disturbances accompanied by what they described as waking dreams that continued long after they had opened their eyes. These patients reported experiencing vivid dreams that seemed to continue into their waking hours, creating confusion about whether they were asleep or awake during certain periods of the night. The dreams consistently involved hearing sounds identical to those being reported by neighbors of the LaLaurie mansion, but the affected individuals insisted that these sounds were reaching them within their own homes, emerging from their walls, floors, or ceilings, rather than from any external source. Dr. Moreau's detailed patient records, which survived until their destruction during a 1954 medical office fire, documented symptoms that appeared in clusters around specific geographic locations. The most severely affected individuals lived within a 3-block radius of Royal Street, with symptom severity decreasing proportionally with distance from the LaLaurie property. This geographic distribution suggested environmental causes rather than contagious disease or psychological epidemic. The affected individuals had no previous history of sleep disorders, anxiety, or other mental disturbances. They were established residents of the quarter who had lived in their current locations for years without experiencing similar problems. Many were merchants, craftsmen, or household managers whose daily responsibilities required clear thinking and reliable mental function. The sudden onset of sleep disturbances among such a stable population suggested external influences rather than individual psychological problems. What made these cases particularly puzzling was that the affected individuals reported hearing specific sounds that corresponded exactly to the activities documented by Mrs. Tremaine and other observers at the LaLaurie mansion. Patients described methodical movements, precise timing, and acoustic properties that matched the reports coming from the Royal Street. However, they insisted that these sounds were originating within their own homes rather than traveling from the mansion. Dr. Moreau consulted with medical colleagues in other cities about similar clusters of unexplained sleep disturbances, but received no reports of comparable cases. This suggested that the phenomena affecting French Quarter residents were unique to their specific geographic location rather than part of broader medical trends affecting urban populations. The localized nature of the symptoms reinforced the theory that environmental factors centered around the LaLaurie property were responsible for the reported effects. Police Sergeant Michael Dubois, whose beat included Royal Street and the surrounding area, received numerous complaints about nighttime disturbances emanating from the LaLaurie mansion. Sergeant Dubois had patrolled the French Quarter since 1893 and was familiar with the typical sources of neighborhood disturbances: late-night celebrations, domestic disputes, commercial activities, and the occasional criminal behavior that required police intervention. However, the complaints about the LaLaurie property described phenomena that fell outside his experience of routine neighborhood problems. Residents who filed complaints with Sergeant Dubois described sounds that followed patterns too regular and systematic for normal human activity. The precision and timing of the reported disturbances suggested mechanical or automated processes rather than the irregular activities typically associated with residential occupation or even clandestine commercial operations. This mechanical quality made the complaints particularly difficult to address through conventional police procedures. Sergeant Dubois attempted to investigate these reports through direct observation and patrol activity, but his efforts were consistently frustrated by the building's apparent emptiness during his official visits. Each time he approached the LaLaurie property during evening hours, he found all external doors securely locked and no evidence of current occupancy visible from the street. The windows remained shuttered, no light escaped to suggest interior activity, and no sounds emerged from within the structure during his presence. However, complaints would resume within hours of Sergeant Dubois' departure, with neighbors reporting that the same patterns of sound and light had returned immediately after the officer moved on to other areas of his patrol. This timing suggested that someone within the mansion was monitoring police activity and adjusting their behavior to avoid detection during official visits. The consistency of this pattern implied systematic surveillance of law enforcement movements rather than coincidental timing. The legal status of the LaLaurie property created additional complications for police investigation. Henri had established his residence through a complex series of legal documents that involved both New Orleans attorneys and French legal representatives. These papers demonstrated clear legal ownership and residency rights, but were deliberately structured to make official intervention difficult without clear evidence of criminal activity. Henri's legal team, led by attorney Charles Beauregard, whose practice specialized in international estate matters, argued that any investigation of the property would constitute unlawful intrusion on private property rights. They maintained that Henri was conducting legitimate restoration work that didn't require ongoing municipal oversight, particularly given the building's historical significance and the family's long-standing ownership. This legal protection made it virtually impossible for police to access the building's interior without probable cause of criminal activity. The complaints filed by neighbors described disturbing sounds and unusual patterns of activity, but didn't constitute evidence of criminal behavior that would justify forced entry or extended surveillance. Louisiana law provided strong protections for property owners, and the restoration of family properties was generally considered a private matter unless clear evidence existed of activities that violated specific statutes. During the final week of October, the nature of activities at the LaLaurie mansion underwent a dramatic transformation that alarmed even the most tolerant neighborhood residents. Instead of the methodical patterns that had characterized Henri's previous activities, the building began displaying behavior that suggested urgent completion of some significant project or deadline. The mansion would remain completely dark for several consecutive nights, creating periods of absolute silence that residents found more disturbing than the previous regular activities. These silent periods lasted for exactly 72 hours, followed by periods of intense activity that continued from sunset to sunrise without interruption. The contrast between complete inactivity and intensive work suggested that Henri was implementing some form of systematic schedule that required alternating phases of preparation and execution. During the active periods, every window in the eastern wing blazed with illumination that was visible from blocks away. Mrs. Tremaine noted that the intensity of lighting during these sessions far exceeded what would be required for normal residential or construction activities. The illumination was bright enough to cast shadows in neighboring courtyards and create a glow that reflected off nearby buildings, suggesting the use of multiple light sources within individual rooms. The sounds accompanying these intensive sessions differed markedly from the methodical movements that had characterized Henri's earlier activities. Instead of the precise, scheduled movements through individual rooms, neighbors reported hearing what seemed like rapid construction or assembly work, followed by equally systematic dismantling of whatever had been built. These assembly and dismantling cycles would repeat multiple times throughout each active night, suggesting that Henri was testing or practicing procedures that required repeated implementation. Mrs. Tremaine's journal entry from October 30th provides the most detailed account of these intensive sessions. Every window blazed with light throughout the night. The sounds that emerged suggested urgent work being completed under severe deadline pressure. There were periods of what seemed like rapid assembly of complex structures, followed by complete silence lasting exactly 15 minutes, then renewed activity that appeared to involve systematic dismantling of whatever had been constructed during the previous phase. Ligios. The 15-minute periods of complete silence that interrupted the intensive work sessions suggested that Henri was following precise schedules that required specific timing intervals. These silent periods weren't random pauses in activity, but rather scheduled breaks that occurred with mechanical regularity throughout each active night. The precision of this timing implied that Henri was implementing procedures that required exact coordination between different phases of work. Neighbors also reported hearing sounds that suggested multiple people working simultaneously during these intensive sessions. However, no one had observed additional individuals entering the mansion, and Henri continued to make his solitary shopping trips during daylight hours. This discrepancy between the apparent number of workers and the documented occupancy created additional questions about what was occurring within the building. The changes at the mansion coincided with reports from throughout the quarter about people behaving in unusual ways. Several individuals who had been observed entering the LaLaurie property during daylight hours were subsequently described by friends and family members as different following their visits. These changes weren't dramatic transformations, but rather subtle alterations in behavior and response patterns that became noticeable only through extended observation. Mary Boudreau, who worked as a seamstress on Chartres Street and was known throughout the quarter for her cheerful disposition and energetic conversation, was among those reported to have visited the mansion during late October. Her sister Catherine later told investigators that Mary had mentioned receiving an offer of well-paid work from the gentleman who returned to the old LaLaurie place. Maud, Mary had seemed excited about the opportunity, as work had been scarce during the economic uncertainties of 1913. After Mary's visit to the mansion, Catherine noticed that her sister had become unusually quiet and seemed to respond to questions as if she were listening to something else at the same time. Mary would pause mid-sentence during conversations, tilt her head as if hearing distant sounds, then continue speaking as if nothing had happened. When asked about these pauses, Mary insisted that she hadn't heard anything unusual and seemed genuinely confused by her sister's observations. Similar reports emerged about other individuals who had reportedly visited Henri during this period. Their friends and family members described consistent patterns of behavioral change, increased silence during social interactions, delayed responses to direct questions, and what several people characterized as listening to sounds that others couldn't hear. These individuals continued their daily routines and showed no obvious signs of distress or physical illness, but their altered behavior was sufficiently noticeable to create concern among those who knew them well. Thomas Broussard, a carpenter who had reportedly done some work for Henri during the early renovation phase, was observed by his wife to have developed similar behavioral changes. He would stop working suddenly, stand motionless for several minutes while appearing to listen intently, then resume his activities without explanation. When questioned about these pauses, Thomas insisted that he was simply taking rest breaks and couldn't understand why his wife was concerned about his work habits. Dr. Moreau documented additional cases of what he termed attention distraction patterns among patients who had reportedly visited the LaLaurie mansion. These individuals appeared to be fully conscious and capable of normal activities, but their responses to questions and social interactions suggested that their attention was partially focused elsewhere. They would provide appropriate answers to direct questions, but with noticeable delays that suggested mental processing difficulties. When pressed about their experiences at the mansion, these individuals provided vague answers about helping with restoration work, but couldn't or wouldn't elaborate on the specific nature of their activities there. They described their time at the property in general terms that avoided specific details about what they had done, whom they had worked with, or what parts of the building they had accessed. This consistent vagueness across multiple individuals suggested either deliberate evasion or genuine inability to recall specific details. The most disturbing aspect of these cases was that the affected individuals seemed unaware that their behavior had changed. When family members expressed concern about their altered responses and interaction patterns, they responded with confusion, insisting that they felt perfectly normal and couldn't understand what others were observing. This created situations where loved ones could clearly see obvious changes in behavior, but the affected individuals genuinely believed that nothing had changed about their mental function or social responses. Dr. Moreau conducted detailed examinations of several affected individuals, but found no evidence of physical illness, head trauma, or obvious psychological disturbance that might account for their altered behavior. Their vital signs remained normal, their physical reflexes appeared unimpaired, and they showed no signs of confusion about their personal identity or basic life circumstances. However, careful observation revealed consistent patterns of delayed response and divided attention that suggested fundamental changes in their cognitive processing. By November the 1st, the LaLaurie mansion stood empty once again. Henri had departed as quietly as he had arrived, leaving no forwarding address, no explanation for his sudden absence, and no indication of when or if he might return. The lights in the eastern wing were extinguished permanently, and the methodical sounds that had characterized the previous weeks ceased entirely. However, the individuals who had visited the mansion during Henri's residency continued to exhibit the behavioral changes that their families and friends had noted, suggesting that whatever had occurred within the building had produced permanent alterations to their mental function. The sudden silence at the mansion was immediately apparent to all neighboring residents, but it wasn't the peaceful quiet of an unoccupied building. Mrs. Tremaine wrote that the absence of sound seems to carry its own weight, as if something significant has been completed that cannot be reversed or undone. The building feels expectant, as though it is waiting for something to return or for some process to continue from where it was interrupted. City records show that Henri never formally vacated the property or provided notification of his departure to municipal authorities. Property taxes continued to be paid punctually through a trust fund that had been established in Paris before his arrival in New Orleans. This arrangement ensured that the mansion would remain legally occupied while physically abandoned, creating a legal status that prevented city authorities from accessing the building for inspection purposes. The trust fund documents, when finally located by international investigators in 1961, revealed that Henri had made elaborate legal provisions for maintaining the property's occupied status indefinitely. These arrangements included automatic tax payments, periodic maintenance contracts, and legal protections against unauthorized entry that would remain in effect regardless of Henri's personal presence or absence. The sophisticated nature of these legal preparations suggested that Henri had planned his eventual departure before beginning his work in New Orleans. Local merchants noted that Henri's departure was as systematic as his earlier activities had been. During the final week of October, he had made additional purchases that seemed designed to conclude his project rather than extend it. These final acquisitions included materials for permanent sealing of spaces, preservation compounds for protecting equipment or documents, and supplies that suggested systematic cleanup and concealment activities. The first comprehensive examination of the mansion's interior didn't occur until 1952, when the building underwent renovation as part of a historical preservation project funded by the Louisiana Historical Society. Workers discovered that the eastern wing contained extensive modifications that bore no relationship to the building's documented architectural history. Rooms had been soundproofed using advanced techniques that seemed remarkably sophisticated for 1913 construction methods, and ventilation systems had been installed that served no apparent purpose for normal residential use. The soundproofing techniques employed in the modified chambers represented engineering knowledge that wouldn't become widely available until decades later. Workers found multiple layers of specialized materials that created acoustic isolation, far exceeding what would be required for normal privacy or noise reduction. The sophistication of these installations suggested access to technical knowledge that was unusual for private residential construction during the early 20th century. More puzzling was the discovery of elaborate ventilation systems that had been integrated into the building's structure without any corresponding modifications to the exterior walls. These systems provided fresh air circulation to the modified chambers while maintaining complete acoustic isolation from the outside environment. The engineering required for this combination of features demonstrated sophisticated understanding of both acoustic and mechanical principles. The most disturbing discovery was the documentation hidden within specially constructed wall cavities throughout the modified wing. These papers, preserved in waterproof containers that had maintained their integrity for nearly 4 decades, included detailed floor plans showing modifications to the building that weren't reflected in any official architectural records. The plans indicated that Henri had created a complex network of spaces that connected previously separate rooms through hidden passages while maintaining the building's external appearance. The hidden documentation also included what appeared to be detailed schedules and progress reports written in a combination of French and coded symbols that proved difficult to decipher completely. The portions that could be translated revealed that Henri had been conducting systematic studies that involved numbered subjects and careful documentation of their responses to unspecified procedures implemented within the modified chambers. The reports referenced specific dates, times, and duration periods that corresponded exactly to the patterns of activity observed by Mrs. Tremaine and other neighborhood residents. This correlation confirmed that the external sounds and lighting patterns had been directly related to whatever procedures Henri had been implementing within the soundproof chambers. The systematic nature of the documentation suggested that Henri had viewed his work as serious scientific research rather than casual experimentation. Investigation into Henri's background revealed that his time in Europe had been spent in intensive study at various academic institutions rather than in simple exile, as he had claimed. Records from the Sorbonne, University of Vienna, and other European universities show that he had audited courses in psychology, acoustics, physiology, and what was then called mental science. His academic interests appeared to focus specifically on the relationship between environmental conditions and human mental function. Henri's personal library, discovered in his Parisian residence after his death, contained extensive collections of research papers and theoretical works that represented the cutting edge of behavioral science during the early 20th century. Many of these works wouldn't become widely available to general practitioners until decades later, suggesting that Henri had access to research networks that provided early access to emerging scientific knowledge. The theoretical framework underlying Henri's work became clearer through analysis of his personal notes, written in the same coded system found in the New Orleans documentation. These notes revealed that Henri believed specific environmental modifications could produce predictable and controllable changes in human behavior and cognitive function. His research suggested that these changes could be implemented without the subject's awareness and could produce effects that persisted long after exposure had ended. The pattern of Henri's activities in New Orleans suggests that he had been implementing a practical test of theoretical frameworks he had developed during his European studies. The modifications he made to the mansion created precisely controlled environmental conditions, while the individuals who visited the property served as subjects for testing whatever procedures he had designed based on his academic research. What makes Henri's case particularly significant is that the effects of his work appeared to be permanent rather than temporary. The individuals who had visited the mansion during his residency never returned to their previous behavioral patterns, even years after their exposure had ended. Their families continued to report the same subtle changes in response patterns and attention focus that had first been noticed in late October 1913, suggesting that Henri's procedures had succeeded in creating lasting modifications to human cognitive function. Dr. Moreau continued to monitor the affected individuals for several years following Henri's departure, and found no evidence that their altered behavior patterns were diminishing over time. If anything, the changes seemed to become more pronounced as years passed, suggesting that Henri's procedures had initiated progressive modifications that continued developing long after the initial exposure. This finding challenged conventional understanding of how environmental influences affected human psychology. The discovery of personal effects belonging to missing individuals beneath the mansion's floorboards during 1963 renovations added a darker dimension to the case. These items belonged to people who had supposedly relocated to other cities during Henri's residency, but whose actual whereabouts had never been confirmed by subsequent investigation. Their families had received letters explaining their departures and promising future contact, but no additional communication had ever been received. Police investigation revealed that at least 6 individuals who had been reported as leaving New Orleans for employment opportunities elsewhere had actually disappeared during the exact period of Henri's residence at the mansion. The handwriting analysis of the departure letters, conducted using techniques developed in the 1950s, revealed that all had been written by the same person using deliberate disguise techniques to simulate different individual writing styles. The personal items found beneath the floorboards suggested that these missing individuals had spent considerable time within the mansion rather than departing immediately as their letters had indicated. The condition and placement of these effects implied systematic concealment rather than casual abandonment, raising questions about what had ultimately happened to their owners. Chemical analysis of the items, conducted using forensic techniques available in the 1960s, revealed traces of compounds that weren't commonly available in 1913. These substances appeared to be preservation agents designed to prevent decomposition of organic materials, suggesting that Henri had taken deliberate steps to maintain these items in pristine condition for reasons that remained unclear. Henri's own fate remained unknown until 1967, when French authorities investigating unrelated property matters located his remains in an unmarked grave in a cemetery outside Marseille. The circumstances of his discovery and the condition of his remains suggested that he had died sometime in the early 1920s, nearly a decade after his departure from New Orleans. Letters found with his remains indicated that he had continued his research activities after leaving Louisiana, conducting increasingly intensive procedures on himself to test the theoretical limits of his environmental modification techniques. These final letters, written in Henri's characteristic combination of French and coded symbols, suggested that he had become convinced his environmental modification procedures were affecting his own mental function in ways he hadn't anticipated. The progressive deterioration evident in his handwriting and the increasingly erratic content of his notes indicated that he had become the ultimate subject of his own research, experiencing firsthand the long-term effects of the procedures he had developed. The international scope of Henri's research became apparent through analysis of correspondence found in his Parisian residence. These letters revealed contacts with researchers at institutions across Europe and America who were investigating similar questions about environmental influences on human behavior. The scope of this correspondence suggested that Henri's work represented one component of a broader international research effort rather than isolated experimentation conducted for personal interest. The correspondence included detailed technical discussions about specific procedures, equipment designs, and theoretical frameworks that indicated active collaboration among researchers in multiple countries. This network appeared to be investigating systematic approaches to environmental modification of human cognitive function, suggesting that Henri's work in New Orleans was part of a larger coordinated research program. Modern scientific analysis of the mansion's modifications conducted during the 1968 historical assessment confirmed that Henri had succeeded in creating environmental conditions capable of producing measurable effects on human mental function. The acoustic properties built into the modified chambers remained active even decades after their construction, creating subtle influences on anyone who spent extended time within the spaces. Researchers who participated in the 1968 assessment reported experiencing attention difficulties, altered sleep patterns, and persistent auditory phenomena following their exposure to the modified chambers. These effects appeared within hours of initial exposure and persisted for weeks after contact had ended, confirming that Henri's environmental modifications continued to function as originally designed. The technical sophistication of Henri's modifications exceeded what would be expected from early 20th century construction techniques. The acoustic properties he achieved required precise understanding of sound physics and material science that represented advanced knowledge for the period. Modern acoustic engineers who analyzed the chambers concluded that Henri's work demonstrated theoretical understanding that wouldn't become widely available until much later in the century. The LaLaurie mansion stands today as evidence that human beings are capable of systematic applications of scientific knowledge to the deliberate modification of human consciousness. Henri's work demonstrated that given sufficient time, resources, and freedom from external oversight, individuals can create environmental conditions designed to alter other people's mental states in ways that persist long after initial exposure has ended. The eastern wing remains sealed because the environmental modifications Henri created continue to function exactly as designed. Modern safety assessments have determined that the acoustic properties built into the chambers pose ongoing risks to anyone exposed to them for extended periods. The spaces are considered too dangerous for public access due to their demonstrated capacity to produce lasting changes in human cognitive function. What Henri accomplished during his residency at the mansion proves that the most effective haunting doesn't require supernatural intervention. Through systematic application of scientific principles and methodical implementation of environmental controls, he created conditions that could modify human consciousness in ways that persisted indefinitely. His techniques represented practical applications of theoretical research that demonstrated the fundamental vulnerability of human mental function to environmental manipulation. The mansion's true significance lies in its demonstration that human consciousness, despite its apparent autonomy and stability, remains vulnerable to systematic modification through environmental control. Henri's work proved that, with sufficient knowledge and determination, human cognitive function could be altered without the subject's awareness or consent, creating changes that would persist throughout their lifetime. The sealed chambers stand as permanent evidence that such modifications are not only possible, but can be implemented by anyone with access to appropriate knowledge and resources. Perhaps the most disturbing realization is that Henri's techniques weren't unique to his particular circumstances or historical period, but rather represented systematic applications of scientific principles that remain valid and potentially replicable in other contexts. The case officially closed with the identification of Henri's remains, but the questions it raised about human vulnerability to environmental manipulation remain unresolved. The individuals whose cognitive function was permanently altered by their exposure to Henri's procedures continued to live their lives without awareness that they had been changed, serving as living proof that human consciousness can be modified without detection by the affected individuals themselves. Sometimes residents along Royal Street still report hearing faint sounds that seem to emerge from the sealed eastern wing during late evening hours. These sounds follow the same methodical patterns that Mrs. Tremaine documented in 1913, suggesting that whatever Henri created within those chambers continues to function according to its original design specifications. The mansion remains a testament to the proposition that some modifications to human consciousness, once successfully implemented, continue to influence their environment indefinitely. The LaLaurie mansion serves as a permanent reminder that the most disturbing human evils often masquerade as scientific advancement. Henri's systematic approach to modifying human consciousness represented not random cruelty, but calculated application of knowledge and methodology to achieve predetermined objectives without regard for basic human dignity or autonomy. His work proved that human consciousness remains fundamentally vulnerable to systematic manipulation by others who possess sufficient knowledge and moral vacancy to implement such procedures.